Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative questions of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Ali Macmillan and I'm a Methodist deacon, currently based at Methodist Central Hall in Westminster. I'm a member of the Methodist Diaconal Order, which is a religious order, and that brings a sense of rhythm and wholeness to my life. Before I trained for ministry, I taught religious education and ethics at secondary school in Oxfordshire. And one of my biggest passions is about coming alongside people where they are and journeying with them as they discover God at work in their lives. Each week, I'm joined by a guest from a different place and space on the pulpit and political landscape. And today, I'm really pleased to introduce Sarah Edwards. Sarah is the Executive Director of the JustMoney Movement, which aims to equip Christians and churches to connect faith and finance so as to shape a fairer, greener world. She has worked in advocacy and campaigning on social justice issues for the past 2 decades, most recently at Tearfund and previously at the Jubilee Debt Campaign, Anti-Slavery International and Health Poverty Action. Sarah lives in North London with her husband and 2 children, where she's involved in preaching and teaching in her local church and is a trustee of the local Foodbank. She enjoys reading, exploring nature, running and eating chocolate. Well, Sarah, we're really delighted to have you with us. You've obviously got a wealth of experience to bring to us, so welcome.
Thanks so much, Ali. It's lovely to be with you.
Well, thank you all, the rest of you as well, for joining us today and tuning in and listening. We know that politics in the pulpit can be a bit of a contentious topic sometimes, but we here at JPIT and Politics in the Pulpit believe that it's essential that the world around us speaks into our churches. So Sarah, when you hear arguments saying that politics should not form part of our preaching, I wonder how you respond to that.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. I think how we make decisions about how we live well together is the sort of broadest definition of politics, isn't it? And I think if you think about it in those broad terms, then I can't see how we can keep politics out of the pulpit. I mean, of course, we don't want to be divisive or sort of party political, but actually, I think it's really important that churches are places that we talk about issues of the day, that we learn how to disagree well, which I think is something that is increasingly difficult in our society and in our sort of social media bubbles quite often. And if we think about the sort of caring for the vulnerable, looking after the created world, enabling each of us to flourish, all of those issues are things that politics determines how those things are done in our society. So if we want to be relevant to that society, if we want to have something to say in the world, then we have to bring politics out within our church teaching.
Oh, wonderful. So perhaps not just could, but should include politics.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, each week I ask my JPIT colleagues for a little roundup of their expertise and what they think we might want to be keeping an eye on in the world this week. Some of their suggestions this week are that universal basic income is to be trialled in England for the first time in Central Jarrow and East Finchley. 30 people will be paid a lump sum of £1,600 a month without any conditions attached. So really radical trial going on there. The TUC, the Trade Unions Congress, has reported that years of austerity has left the UK hugely underprepared for the COVID pandemic, as they're reflecting back on that. And nearly 80 primary school girls in Afghanistan are believed to have been poisoned, apparently due to a personal grudge. Huge wealth of things going on in the world, and just things that make your heart cry. Sarah, from your context, I wonder if there's any key political justice issues or political events that you would want to bring out for us.
Yeah, so I'm going to be reflecting a bit on this later, but Tax Justice Sunday is happening this Sunday, which is part of something called Fair Tax Week. And that's really an opportunity for us to think about tax and the common good, and even celebrate the role of responsible and fair taxation in our society. The other thing, this week is World Environment Day. In fact, it's today, but that's an opportunity really to think about some of the environmental issues. We have a campaign at the Just Money Movement. We're really trying to seek a greener, fairer finance system. And one of the ways we're doing that is through our Don't Bank on Plastics campaign, which is calling for banks to change the way they invest in the plastics industry, reduce investments in the production and consumption of plastics, and invest instead in alternatives. So the World Environment Day, and that's an opportunity for us to take action. So we're asking our supporters and campaigners to contact their banks, and actually we're focusing at the moment on HSBC as the biggest bank in the UK, one of the biggest investors in the plastics industry, and asking them to change their ways.
Oh, wonderful. And really interesting to see the tie-up and the connection there between different justice issues. So as you said, some key justice and church dates. It's World Environment Day on the 5th of June, Fair Tax Week, the 8th to the 18th of June, and Tax Justice Sunday on the 11th of June. So all those things that you've named going on this week. So lots for us to be thinking about. Our Bible readings for this Sunday, the 11th of June, Psalm 50, 7 to 15, Hosea 5, 15 to 6, 6, Romans 4, 13 to 25, and Matthew 9, 9 to 13, and then 8 to 26. With our metaphorical newspapers open in one hand, let's get our Bibles open as well. Sarah, I wonder if there's a particular passage or theme or question that's jumped out for you where you'd like us to begin this week.
Well, I think the obvious one for me that's jumped out is the call of Matthew in the gospel reading in Matthew 9, and we hear that Jesus sees Matthew sitting in his tax collector's booth, and he says, "Follow me," and Matthew gets up and follows him. So I want to really focus in on that story of the call of Matthew, and think about what it might mean for all of us to hear that call of Jesus, to follow him, but particularly for Matthew as a tax collector. And as I say, it's Tax Justice Sunday this Sunday, and it's an opportunity for us to think about a bit more what that meant and what that means for us as well. So as a tax collector in the Roman Empire, Matthew would have been part of administering the oppression of the people, and so he would have been seen as doing something that wasn't just perhaps a little bit unpopular, but actually something sinful, something that was really seen as putting him in sort of beyond the pale. And so he's there doing this role, playing this role within a system of economic and political oppression. And Jesus comes and calls him out of that, and calls him into a new community, into a new role as a disciple of Jesus, into a completely different life, actually. So I was reflecting a bit on what that means, the role that we each perhaps play within systems that might not be so obviously oppressive, but actually if we look at the financial system, if we look at the economic system that we live in, it is one that is fueling the climate crisis. It is one that sees huge, grotesque extremes of wealth inequality and poverty, and therefore it is one that actually is highly problematic. And we do all play a role. And one of the things that we like to do in the Just Money Movement when we're talking to people is say, well, look in your pockets, look in your wallet, in your bag. If you're in a church congregation, look in the collection plate. You've got coins or notes there, or you might have a bank card. I mean, increasingly people might be using their phones. All of those things that we use to pay, that our money, have words on them, have symbols on them. Cash might say something about the head of state of the nation that we live in. The bank card might have the name of an international, multinational institution, a bank that actually is extremely powerful. Mm-hmm. And so by by carrying those things and using them in our day-to-day lives, we are actually participating in a system. And so what can we do to be a bit more reflective about that? And we might not be called out of it. So it's interesting that Jesus calls Matthew in a very sort of radical way, doesn't he? But in another story in scripture, we see Jesus in an encounter with another tax collector, with Zacchaeus, who's a tax collector, and we hear about in Luke's gospel. And there Jesus has this encounter with Zacchaeus, which leads Zacchaeus to ask for forgiveness, to make restitution to the community. But there's no suggestion there that he changes his role, that he leaves his job as a tax collector. And most of us won't be called out of our roles. And yet there are things that we can perhaps think about doing differently as we think about. So to talk a little bit more, if I can, about tax specifically, if we look at the role of tax, often tax is seen perhaps as a burden, something that we have to pay. And yet tax can actually be a way that we love our neighbours, and that we care for creation, and that we contribute to the common good. So how can we as Christians have a conversation about what is the role of tax in our society? So in the Just Money movement, we have a campaign for the tax system to be reformed, actually, because there is a much greater emphasis in the UK tax system on taxes on income, on work, and less of a burden of tax on wealth. So it's actually quite an unfair distribution, and we're campaigning for there to be more taxes on wealth, which would make for a more equitable tax system, and would also raise revenue for those sorts of things that we care about, that we want to see in our society, for the vulnerable to be cared for everyone have the opportunity to flourish, for our natural spaces to be looked after. So how can we play our part within that tax system? Many of us as taxpayers, all of us, as I say, with some connection to the money, to the financial system, to the economy. It might be as consumers, so as individuals and as churches, we buy things. Are we aware of what the tax behaviour of the companies we buy from is? The Fair Tax Week that we're coming into is organised by the Fair Tax Foundation, which has this Fair Tax mark, which is a labelling scheme. So you can actually look out for the Fair Tax mark in companies that you buy from to see if they are responsibly and fairly paying their taxes.
That's fascinating and really helpful to have some really kind of practical things that we can all do, because it feels a bit, when you first started talking about kind of tax and the systems, I just was sat here feeling a bit overwhelmed. Well, how can I have a part to play in that? But actually there are some just really practical things that we as individuals can do to think about how we use our own money. I think that's really, thank you for that. Anything else from that Matthew reading that you might want to tie into that?
Yeah, so I think what Jesus says, so he's criticised, isn't he, for spending time with Matthew and with all these other tax collectors and sinners. And it says the Pharisees ask him about this, and he says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And obviously that's quoting one of the other readings, Hosea, which we can perhaps come to in a moment. But what he goes on in the second part of this Matthew passage to do is really to embody, I would say, that mercy. He brings the dead girl back to life, and he heals the bleeding woman, and we really see him in spending time with those people who've been ostracized, in healing and bringing back from the dead a woman and a girl, so people again on the margins of society, people who would have been, if you think about the bleeding woman, someone who would have been outside of her, cast out of her society. Because of that, we see him loving, showing God's love, showing God's mercy in the way that he lives and spends time with people and heals them and really bringing God's mercy. So again, it's kind of, how can we think about what does it mean to embody God's mercy, not to be overly concerned, as Jesus clearly wasn't, with reputation and with how that appeared to the religious authorities or to the people around him, but actually, what does it mean to live that out in our own lives?
Yeah, and that question of not worrying what others are thinking about what you're doing, but what does God want you to do in this circumstance? Sometimes we hold those things in tension, don't we?
We absolutely do, and it's not an easy place to be, and particularly as we're not talking here about sort of being, I don't know, fashionable or in crowd. We're talking about being seen to be immoral and breaking religious laws, and being seen to be, someone who's not behaving in the way that a religious leader, as Jesus was, should behave. And so those are things that we will all struggle with in different ways, in different contexts.
Yeah, I wonder if there's anything in this passage which is more challenging for us or difficult for us to grapple with.
I think, well, the call of Matthew, as I said earlier on, calling Matthew completely out of a system, I think is something that that many of us who are activists struggle with, because we generally, particularly if we're in the UK, for example, we do live within a system, and it's virtually impossible for us to completely extract ourselves out of it. And I know people who have, tried to move off grid, to live in rural areas, to be self-sufficient and so on. But it certainly isn't what all of us are doing. And I don't think it's what all of us are called to do, actually. But that does mean there's a tension there. There's a challenge there. And as you said, it can feel quite overwhelming. I mean, I talked about tax, but if we talk about our spending choices or our relationship to the banking system, it's enormous. And so I think this challenge of what does it mean to probably not be called completely out of the system, actually, but to live in, as Jesus said, as we hear elsewhere in scripture, the now and the not yet, so something of trying to seek change, to seek justice, to live in merciful ways, and yet recognizing that in every sort of everyday encounters and the way we live our lives, inevitably we're still part of that system, I think is a struggle and a tension for many of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I really relate to that, and that when you were talking about money, to try and live and not engage with money in today's world is virtually impossible. So yeah, holding those things together. Wonderful. And what about any of the other readings? They kind of relate quite well to one another this week, don't they? So I don't know if
they really do, and I think that's really interesting. So as I said, Jesus quotes the Hosea passage, doesn't he? In verse 12 of Matthew passage, he says, it says to the Pharisees, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And that's a direct quote from the Hosea passage, where we have this exchange between the people of Israel and God, and God is really saying, well, what is he saying? What does it mean to that God desires mercy and not sacrifice, an acknowledgement of God, the Hosea passage goes on, rather than burnt offerings. So it's that thing again, isn't it, about God isn't interested in the sort of religious observances, and what might that look like today. He's not necessarily interested, I guess, in how many prayer meetings we attend or how many sort of church things we do, how many sermons we preach, but he's interested in our hearts. He's interested in merciful lives, and so yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount more that could be said about the Hosea passage, and some very difficult language, actually. Let's be honest, it is a very challenging book, the book of Hosea. I'm not going to go into it in detail here, but I think that theme of mercy and not sacrifice is the one that I would draw out, and that's very much also in the psalm, actually, isn't it? And Psalm 50 is one that I actually use quite a lot in talking about money, because God is saying, I don't need your sacrifices. I created everything. Everything is mine. there's that amazing verse in Psalm 50, verse 12. If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you, for the world is mine and all that is in it. So again, there's a sense in which we are invited in to participate, to play a part. And maybe that's something that we can reflect on as we're struggling in the system and yet not of the system sort of situation, that actually it's not ultimately our responsibility to change to save the world, is it? It's our responsibility to play our part and to join in with what God is calling us to do. And so in a way that can be something that can give us a real sense of peace, because he doesn't need our offerings. What he wants from us is for us to live, to follow him and to play that part.
That reminder. I remember when I was at a theological training college, we were reminded, you're not called to save the world. Jesus has already done that.
Exactly. Yeah, completely. So I think that's a reassurance, I suppose, that comes through in that Hosea passage and in the Psalm. And then likewise from the Romans passage, the part that struck me from the Romans passage is in verse 17, where Paul says, "The God who gives life to the dead and calls things that are not as though they were." And I thought that, well, first of all, really resonates with the gospel passage, doesn't it? Because we have Jesus calling Matthew, someone who is not in a place of being a follower of God, a disciple and so on. He's a tax collector, and yet he calls him into as though he were, and spends time with him. But he also actually does that thing of giving life to the dead in healing Jairus's daughter and bringing her back from the dead and healing the bleeding woman. We see in action that bringing life to the dead. And so again, I was reflecting on how can we seek those glimpses of life, which might be in our relationships with one another on a very personal level, within our families and church communities and wider communities, but also in our economic relationships. How can we seek life-giving ways of paying taxes and relating to the financial system and spending our money and saving our money? How can we bring life to the dead? We have a system which does actually produce death and suffering, and to be really sort of blunt about it, in the way in which the climate crisis is being fueled, nature is being harmed, people are unable in this cost of living crisis to feed their families, and globally we're seeing that's on a much more extreme scale. How can we bring life and see and glimpse life in places through the way that we deal with money?
Yeah, I think that's, and I found it really helpful how you brought in that kind of global element as well there. We haven't talked about that much, but depending on the context people are preaching in, that might be something that they want to bring into the conversation.
Absolutely. So the way in which, for example, in terms of taxation, you can see the way in which companies operate globally as that could bring life and jobs and prosperity to communities and to places, but can also bring death and can also bring suffering and can bring harm to places, polluting lands and affecting communities harmfully that are working perhaps in exploitative conditions, being badly treated by either multinational companies or sometimes their subsidiaries. And taxes is one aspect of that. So there's lots of aspects of that. And actually the Just Money Movement is part of a broader coalition called the Corporate Justice Coalition, which is calling for more accountability for companies that might be headquartered here in the UK, but actually through their supply chains are operating in all different parts of the world. So that's one thing, thinking about our relationship to those companies, perhaps as consumers, but also, as citizens. And we operate campaigns that include shareholder actions. So we sometimes might go to AGMs and ask questions, and it's really important that we play those roles in the broader context of how companies operate globally. And then, of course, how and where they pay their taxes is really crucial. So quite often we're seeing companies that are finding ways to avoid paying taxes in the places where people are working and where goods are being produced, which are quite often in the global south, they're not paying the fair and responsible level of tax. And so again, through our Church Action for Tax Justice campaign, we've been calling for things like a minimum global level of corporation tax, closing loopholes like tax havens, where often you see companies and wealthy individuals actually trying to find ways to avoid paying the right level of tax. And if you think about taxes as the way in which we raise the revenue to create the opportunities for people to flourish, so in the global south, as much as here, paying for those public services, paying for those social safety nets, enabling people to have the public goods of health and education and so forth. If those taxes aren't being paid there, then people are suffering and they're not able to access those goods. They're not able to flourish in the way that they could do otherwise. So it's beholden upon us individuals, but also on those companies. And so for us to hold them to account for the way in which they operate globally.
And we've seen those stories in the news, haven't we, about people not paying taxes, or finding ways of avoiding that. But also I find it interesting that when individuals or companies are paying tax, that's kind of highlighted as this is good news, people are going above and beyond. You think, well, no, that's just what they should be doing. Not that we shouldn't highlight good examples, but I think that's quite interesting that that's flagged in that way. And
no,
you can
absolutely.
see,
yeah. No, it's really interesting, as you say. It's really our duty, isn't it, as citizens? And actually, that's what we're told in the Bible. Pay your taxes. But often that isn't the case, or there are ways of complicatedly avoiding paying as much tax as people should. Or, as I say, the whole system is set up such that taxes on wealthy individuals, companies that have made huge profits recently. We've seen this with the energy companies, haven't we? Who are not paying taxes, or companies that are just making enormous profits from the way in which they operate, and again, because of where they're domiciled and so forth, are avoiding paying much tax in those places.
Well, lots in there to get our teeth into, and in this Tax Justice Week, isn't it nice? And all things line up to enable us to really highlight that in our pulpits as well. As we kind of just draw to a close, are there any kind of other things that you were hoping to get a chance to say or just highlight for people?
I think just that sense, those two themes, I suppose, that are drawn out so clearly in these, across these readings, of God desiring mercy and not sacrifice. So heart attitudes and actions rather than religious observance and outward appearance. And then that thing about glimpsing life and bringing life out of people and places and situations where there is death. So I suppose I would just want to draw that out, really, through the call of Matthew, but through thinking about our congregations, thinking about our own lives. How can we reflect and live out more of that mercy and life-giving approach that Jesus so clearly embodies in those scriptures?
Well, that seems like a pretty good place to wind things up. So thank you so much, Sarah Edwards from the JustMoney Movement, for coming on and sharing your wisdom and your reflections with us today. We really appreciate your time. And thank you for everybody else for joining us, whether to ask the questions about whether or how we should preach politics in our pulpits this week. If you enjoyed listening to this episode of Politics in the Pulpit, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast and share this episode with your friends. We have some online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics. You can find us on Twitter at @pulpit_politics or using the hashtag politics in the pulpit. We also have a Facebook group, and you can find that through the Facebook page of the Joint Public Issues team. And of course, there's the website, which is jpit.uk. That's jpit.uk. And the question we're leaving you with from this week's readings is how can we seek life-giving ways of responding to God's call on our lives, and how can we challenge unjust systems? And so let's go into our politics and our pulpits this week with a blessing. May you be anointed with God's Spirit as you bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, and help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen.